The moment I stepped outside that morning, I had no idea my quiet street would erupt into chaos. One second, my service dog was happily wagging its tail. The next, a chemical spray hit it, and I froze in disbelief. My neighbor, the HOA president, was standing there with a smirk, daring me to react. I knew this wasn't just petty jealousy or a minor feud. This crossed a line I never thought someone in my community would dare to cross. Police were called, and her face went pale the instant. They mentioned federal law. How could someone so seemingly ordinary commit something so outrageous right in broad daylight? I live in a neighborhood that most people would call peaceful, even idyllic. Rows of manicured lawns stretched along quiet streets, and children's laughter often echoed from nearby yards in the late afternoons. My house sat comfortably in the middle of the block, a modest red brick home with a small garden I tended to every weekend, alongside my service dog, Max. Life was simple but fulfilling. I had routines that brought me comfort. Morning coffee on the porch as sunlight spilled across the lawn, evenings spent tinkering in the garage, and weekends filled with walks through the nearby park. The neighbors waved, exchanged smiles, and life seemed predictable. Our HOA was small but active, the kind that prided itself on maintaining the neighborhood's standards. At first it seemed harmless, sending occasional reminders about lawn care or mailbox colors. I followed the rules as best I could, keeping Max's toys out of sight, trimming the hedges, and painting the fences on schedule. But there were whispers among residents about the HOA president, Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her late 50s with a sharp gaze and a reputation for strict enforcement. Some said she enjoyed the authority. Others kept quiet to avoid confrontation. I never thought much of it, until minor inconsistencies began to appear in her inspections. A hedge slightly overgrown one week, a mailbox with peeling paint, even. Minor driveway stains, all flagged in notes that she left on our door. I tried to brush it off at first, attributing it to bureaucracy, but it became clear that there was more at play. Each note felt less like a guideline and more like a test, a subtle push toward something bigger. Max, my loyal companion, seemed to sense the growing tension. He became protective, following me more closely and occasionally barking at passing neighbors, though nothing threatening, just instinctive. Even our walks to the park started to feel tense, as if unseen eyes were tracking our every move. The first truly unsettling sign came with an innocuous letter, stamped with the HOA seal. It referenced a community compliance issue regarding our garden setup and a recent fence repair. At first glance, it seemed routine, but the tone carried an edge that made my stomach twist. It wasn't just a friendly reminder. It was a warning, one that felt laden with expectation and scrutiny. I didn't know it yet, but this was the spark that ignited my passion. The beginning of a conflict that would push me, Max, and our peaceful life into a storm we never anticipated. Every day afterward brought minor annoyances that escalated quickly. Notes multiplied. Unexpected inspections occurred. Neighbors who had once been friendly glanced at each other with new wariness, some avoiding eye contact. And through it all, Mrs. Patterson's presence loomed, quiet but deliberate, as if she were orchestrating the tension like a conductor building toward a crescendo. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but soon impossible to ignore. Little did I know, the dispute wasn't just about rules or property. It was about power, control, and the lengths someone would go to assert it. And everything I thought I knew about my neighborhood, the calm, the predictability, the safety, was about to unravel completely. The neighborhood that once felt like a sanctuary had slowly transformed into a cage. Every day seemed to bring a new rule, a new fine, or a subtle attack disguised as community standards. It started innocently enough, an email reminding me about the acceptable height of grass, another warning about Max's toys left in the yard, but quickly spiraled into a relentless cascade of harassment that made me question my place in my own home. I tried to follow every guideline meticulously. I trimmed the hedges to the exact inch specified in the HOA handbook, repainted the mailbox twice in a single month, and even moved Max's favorite resting spots indoors. Yet despite my compliance, the notes continued to come. They became more specific, more invasive. One letter cited the unauthorized placement of personal items in communal sightlines, referencing my garden gnomes and potted plants. Another demanded that I remove a small welcome mat because its color didn't match the HOA-approved palette. Each note felt like a calculated jab, a reminder that no matter how hard I tried, it would never be enough. I began documenting everything. Photos, videos, copies of letters, anything that might protect me if the situation escalated further. My evenings, once peaceful, turned into anxious sessions of recording and cataloging. Max sensed my stress. He became restless, pacing the living room, whining whenever I stepped outside. I could feel his unease, mirroring my own. It wasn't just about property compliance anymore. It was about a creeping fear that our sanctuary, our home, was no longer safe. The first real confrontation came during an unexpected inspection. Mrs. Patterson arrived unannounced, clipboard in hand, and her sharp eyes swept over the yard with calculated scrutiny. I greeted her politely, masking my frustration, but she barely acknowledged my presence. Her gaze lingered on the flower beds, the patio furniture, the subtle slope of the driveway. "This isn't up to code," she said, voice clipped. "You have 48 hours to correct these violations." She left as abruptly as she arrived, leaving a small typed notice pinned to the door. I stared at it, incredulous. 48 hours? To adjust landscaping and fix minor aesthetic details? The audacity was staggering. It wasn't just the deadlines, it was the escalation of fines. Each violation carried a penalty, which increased with every subsequent letter. Within a month, the HOA claimed I owed hundreds of dollars for non-compliance, despite my meticulous attention to detail. I attempted to contest the charges, attending HOA meetings and submitting formal complaints. The response was cold, procedural, and often dismissive. I was told that my objections were not substantiated, or that the violations were at the board's discretion. It was a Kafkaesque nightmare, a system designed to frustrate and intimidate rather than resolve. Neighbors began to notice. Some avoided, me hesitant to become involved. Others whispered, sharing stories of their own encounters with Mrs. Patterson. A few brave souls offered sympathy, recounting fines and threats they had endured. It was clear I wasn't alone, yet the sense of isolation persisted. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, where a single misstep could trigger another punitive action. Then came the public shaming. One morning, I found a large sign posted at the entrance to the community detailing alleged violations in my yard and warning other residents to comply or face consequences. The message was humiliating, designed to intimidate not just me but anyone who might consider defiance. I felt a surge of anger, a mix of disbelief and determination. This wasn't just about rules, it was a battle of wills. Legal notices followed. Letters citing obscure clauses in the HOA bylaws, threats of liens, and potential legal action became a constant backdrop to daily life. Each document seemed deliberately convoluted, filled with jargon meant to confuse and overwhelm. I sought advice from a lawyer who confirmed that many of the claims were borderline frivolous, yet acknowledged the difficulty of challenging an entrenched HOA with seemingly unlimited procedural authority. One particularly tense evening, Mrs. Patterson appeared in the driveway, accompanied by a property management consultant I had never met. They scrutinized every inch of the yard, measuring, photographing, and taking notes. I stood silently, fists clenched, as they circled like predators. The consultant muttered about previous complaints and community standards. At the same time, Mrs. Patterson's cold smile suggested that she was savoring my discomfort. I wanted to shout, to confront them, but I knew any reaction could be used against me. The harassment escalated further with direct interference in daily life. Max, who had always been well-behaved, was suddenly targeted. Complaints were made about his presence in the yard, alleging that he was intimidating to neighbors and non-compliant with community safety standards. I felt my stomach tighten. My loyal companion, who had never harmed anyone, was being vilified to serve an agenda I couldn't comprehend. The absurdity was infuriating, yet beneath it lay a genuine threat. The implication that even minor deviations from arbitrary rules could be weaponized. Weeks passed in a haze of tension, every day bringing a new letter, fine, or inspection. I began to notice patterns, the timing of visits, the specific items targeted, and even the way Mrs. Patterson communicated with neighbors to subtly isolate me. It became a psychological battle, a game of endurance where the stakes were my peace of mind and the security of my home. Friends offered advice, urging me to document everything, to stand firm, but the pressure was relentless. Then came the tipping point, a confrontation at a community meeting. I had attended, hoping to appeal the mounting fines and harassment, only to be met with hostility. Mrs. Patterson presented my case to the board, highlighting minor infractions, exaggerating details, and framing my compliance efforts as a sign of defiance. Other residents, some supportive, were drowned out by her influence and the weight of her authority. I left the meeting stunned, realizing that logic and reason were powerless against someone who thrived on control and public spectacle. At home, I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. Mornings were filled with coffee and walks with Max. Evenings were spent on small projects and quiet reflection. But the letters and threats persisted. One afternoon, I discovered a notice slipped under my door, a citation for unauthorized outdoor structures, referencing a small dog ramp I had installed for Max's safety. The ramp was functional, harmless, and had been in place for months without issue. Yet suddenly, it was a violation. The message was clear. Nothing was safe, nothing was private. Every action I took could be scrutinized, twisted, and punished. The stress took a toll. Sleep became restless, and anxiety was constant. Max seemed to sense it, pacing more, whining at distant sounds, reacting to every minor disturbance. I could feel the walls of my own home closing in, the neighborhood that once offered comfort now a theater of tension and fear. I began to question what had triggered this level of obsession from Mrs. Patterson. Was it personal? Was it the HOA's power culture? Or was it simply the thrill of wielding control over others? Then came the incident that would define the next chapter of this ordeal. One morning, as I stepped outside with Max, I noticed Mrs. Patterson standing near the edge of my yard, a spray bottle in hand. Before I could react, a chemical hit Max, startling him and causing him to yelp. My heart raced, fury and shock mingling in a dangerous swirl. Neighbors emerged, some shocked, while others were unsure how to intervene. I called the police immediately, my hands trembling. Mrs. Patterson froze the instant they arrived, her smug expression replaced with the pale mask of someone caught in a serious legal bind. Federal law, I learned, classified harming a service animal as a crime, and suddenly the power dynamic shifted in my favor. Yet the tension didn't dissipate instantly. The aftermath of that moment rippled through the neighborhood, through the HOA, and through my own sense of security. Legal proceedings began, whispers spread, and the community's perception of Mrs. Patterson slowly changed. But the story was far from over. The rise in stakes, the escalation of conflict, and the mounting tension had set the stage for an even more dramatic confrontation. This kind would define the climax of this ordeal. Every small victory felt temporary, overshadowed by the psychological toll of weeks of harassment. Letters continued to arrive, inspections were scheduled, and I remained vigilant. The experience was exhausting, yet it also revealed a resilience I didn't know I possessed. I learned to navigate bureaucracy, document meticulously, and prepare for unexpected escalation. Max remained my constant companion, his calm presence a grounding force amidst the chaos. As the days turned into weeks, I realized the stakes were no longer just about compliance or fines. They were about asserting my right to live peacefully, about defending those who could not protect themselves, and about exposing the absurd lengths an HOA could go to maintain control. Every encounter, every letter, every fine was a piece of a puzzle that, once completed, would reveal a story of conflict, injustice, and the eventual confrontation that would change everything. And so, as tension mounted, fines piled up, and the community watched with a mixture of curiosity and caution. I knew one thing with certainty. This rising tide of harassment and intimidation was building toward a breaking point. Something had to give, and when it did, the outcome would be explosive, not just for me, but for Mrs. Patterson, the HOA, and the entire neighborhood. Every late-night worry, every meticulous adjustment to the lawn, every letter carefully documented, was leading to a moment of reckoning. The following events promised to be the most intense yet, where patience would clash with vindictiveness, rules would clash with justice, and fear would clash with courage. The storm was near and there was no turning back. The stage was set, the players in position, and the audience, neighbors, friends, and even casual observers, waited to witness the crescendo of a conflict that had escalated far beyond garden, gnomes, and hedges. The calm before the storm had ended, and the climax of this ordeal was about to begin. Would the HOA overreach one time too many? Would the law finally intervene, or would the relentless pressure of months of harassment push everyone to the edge? One thing was clear. The story was far from over, and the tension, carefully built and painfully endured, was about to erupt in ways that no one would forget. The tension that had been building for months finally reached its breaking point one sweltering afternoon. I had spent hours preparing for yet another HOA inspection, expecting the usual cold stare, the clipboard, the meticulous scrutiny. But this time felt different. Something in the air suggested that the conflict was about to reach its apex, and I couldn't ignore the gnawing anxiety in my chest. Max padded beside me, sensing the gravity of the moment, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging within me. Mrs. Patterson arrived as expected, flanked by two other board members and a representative from the property management company. Their eyes scanned every inch of my yard with predatory precision. I had meticulously documented everything, photographs, videos, notes, and legal references, but as they approached, I felt a surge of frustration. All my preparation could be challenged. All my patience had been tested to its limits. And then it began. The first accusation came swiftly. "These flowers are not in compliance with community aesthetics," Mrs. Patterson said, her tone sharp, authoritative. "You've altered the landscaping without prior approval." I calmly pointed out the emails granting permission months earlier. Still, she waved them aside, insisting they were outdated and irrelevant. Every word she spoke was designed to provoke, to assert dominance, to make me doubt my own actions. Then came the fines. The HOA representative handed me a thick stack of invoices, each one more absurd than the last. I skimmed through them. Unauthorized garden ornaments, excessive driveway stains, improperly aligned mailbox. My head spun. I felt a flush of rage and disbelief, but I reminded myself to stay composed. This was a test of endurance, of strategy, not impulsive confrontation. It was then that Mrs. Patterson took a step too far. She gestured toward Max. "Your dog's behavior has become a liability to the neighborhood. Complaints have been filed." My blood ran cold. Max, who had been my unwavering companion through every moment of stress, was now being used as a weapon against me. I could feel the weight of months of psychological warfare pressing down, the frustration, the helplessness, the exhaustion. but I refused to crumble. I knew this confrontation had to be decisive. Taking a deep breath, I pulled out the documentation I had carefully prepared. Photos of Max behaving perfectly, records of his training and service certification, and legal references showing the federal protection afforded to service animals. I presented them methodically, refusing to allow my anger to cloud the facts. The room fell silent for a moment, a tense pause where power dynamics teetered on a knife's edge. Then came the bombshell. A local officer, who had been called earlier regarding the chemical spraying incident, stepped forward to corroborate my claims. Mrs. Patterson froze, her previously smug expression replaced with a flicker of panic. The officer outlined the legal implications clearly. Harming a service animal was a federal offense, punishable by substantial fines and potential imprisonment. The weight of authority had shifted dramatically. Suddenly, the antagonist who had wielded power with impunity was exposed as someone on the wrong side of the law. The reaction was immediate. Other board members exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers rippled through the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered, and Mrs. Patterson's composure began to crumble. She attempted to argue, to reclaim her authority. Still, each word she uttered only served to highlight the absurdity of her previous actions further. The facade of control she had maintained for months began to fracture in real time. I could feel a rush of vindication, but I didn't let it blind me. I methodically reviewed every violation they had cited, countering each one with documentation, legal statutes, and procedural inconsistencies. The narrative that had been manipulated to paint me as a non-compliant, difficult resident began to unravel. Each point I made chipped away at the credibility of the HOA's campaign, exposing a pattern of harassment and overreach. Neighbors, who had been silent observers until now, began to murmur their support. One by one, small gestures, a nod, a whispered agreement, shifted the energy in the room. Mrs. Patterson's isolation became evident. The authority she had so meticulously curated was evaporating before my eyes. I could see her calculating, desperately trying to regain control, but the tide had turned. Then, unexpectedly, she made a move that would seal her humiliation. In a desperate attempt to assert dominance, she pointed at Max again, insisting that the dog's presence was still a violation. I calmly interjected, citing the federal law once more, emphasizing that any further harassment of a service animal would constitute a criminal offense. The room fell silent, tension crackling like electricity. Mrs. Patterson's face went pale, her voice faltering as the reality of her position sank in. It was a surreal moment. For months, she had orchestrated intimidation campaigns, fines, and psychological tactics, and now, in a single confrontation, the truth was laid bare. The community witnessed her authority dismantled, her overreach exposed, and her personal vendetta brought into the light. I felt a mixture of relief and adrenaline, the culmination of weeks of stress and strategic preparation coalescing into this pivotal moment of triumph. As the confrontation continued, I realized that this wasn't just about me or Max anymore. It was a statement to the entire neighborhood that abuse of power, intimidation, and harassment could be challenged, that documentation and perseverance could prevail against arbitrary authority. Mrs. Patterson attempted a few final remarks, but they were weak and unconvincing. They were quickly dismissed by the HOA board and neighbors alike. The intensity of the moment reached its peak when the officer confirmed that further complaints against Max or me would be met with legal consequences. The room, once charged with tension and fear, now hummed with a different energy. Relief, vindication, and a sense of justice restored. Neighbors exchanged glances, some smiling, others shaking their heads in disbelief at how far the conflict had escalated. I could feel a shift inside myself as well. Months of anxiety, stress, and indignation transformed into empowerment. The knowledge that I had stood my ground, navigated harassment with patience, strategy, and factual precision, instilled a deep sense of confidence. Max, sensing the change in atmosphere, wagged his tail slightly, his calm presence a reminder of the bond that had sustained me through the storm. Mrs. Patterson, visibly shaken and stripped of her aura of authority, retreated quietly, muttering about procedural follow-ups and legal consultations. It was clear that her position had been undermined irreparably. The board members who had once followed her lead now avoided eye contact, realizing that the tide of public perception and legal reality had shifted decisively against her. Even as the immediate confrontation ended, I knew the repercussions would continue to ripple through the neighborhood. There would be discussions, formal reviews, and likely attempts to regain control, but the momentum had changed. The conflict had reached its peak, and the most intense, emotionally charged chapter had concluded with a clear victory for truth and justice. Yet, even in triumph, a quiet question lingered in my mind. Could the HOA recover from this exposure? Would Mrs. Patterson attempt further retaliation behind the scenes? The answers were uncertain, but for now, the storm had passed, and the narrative of intimidation had been decisively challenged. Standing on my porch, watching neighbors whisper and speculate, I realized the full scope of what had just occurred. And months of harassment, fines, and psychological pressure had culminated in a single confrontation that revealed the absurdity, illegality, and cruelty of the HOA's actions. The climax of this saga had arrived, delivering both vindication and a sobering reminder of how fragile the balance of power can be in a seemingly peaceful community. As I looked at Max, I whispered a quiet thank you, recognizing the role he had played in this ordeal. His presence, his loyalty, and his very existence had been central to exposing the truth. The tension that had gripped us for so long was finally easing, but the echo of the climax, the intensity, the confrontation, the emotional roller coaster would linger in memory, a pivotal turning point in a story that was far from ordinary, and while the immediate battle had been won, the ripple effects of this confrontation promised to carry consequences, revelations, and lessons for both the HOA and the neighborhood. The story, though momentarily resolved, had set the stage for a resolution that would leave a lasting impact and a final understanding of the power, persistence, and perseverance required to confront injustice head-on. The confrontation that had consumed my life for months finally began to settle into a new reality. The tension, harassment, and constant scrutiny that had once defined each day gradually gave way to a sense of relief. However, it was tempered by the knowledge that the echoes of the ordeal would linger. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now approached me with cautious smiles, hesitant congratulations, or even apologies for their initial silence. The atmosphere of fear and control that Mrs. Patterson had cultivated dissolved, replaced by a tentative sense of normalcy, though everyone seemed aware that the neighborhood had changed irrevocably. Legal proceedings continued, but the momentum was clearly in my favor. The documentation I had meticulously gathered, the photos, videos, letters, and legal references, served as indisputable evidence of the HOA's harassment and the overreach that had targeted both me and Max. The federal law-protecting service. Animals had shifted the balance decisively, rendering any further attempt at intimidation legally perilous. It was a vindication not just for me, but for anyone in the community who had been quietly subjected to similar pressures, reminding us, all that rules cannot override the law or basic human decency. I also took steps to formalize protections against future harassment. Letters were sent to the HOA and its board, clearly outlining the legal boundaries and the consequences of any further violations. I engaged a lawyer to ensure that my rights, and Max's, would be safeguarded, and made clear that any attempt at retaliation would be met with immediate legal action. This proactive approach not only reinforced our safety, but also signaled to the community that abuse of power would not go unchallenged. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to heal in its own way. Some residents, previously intimidated by Mrs. Patterson's authority, began speaking more openly, sharing stories of minor violations, fines, or letters they had received over the years. Conversations that had been whispered now occurred openly, and a quiet solidarity emerged among those who had been quietly compliant for fear of reprisal. By confronting the abuse head-on, I had inadvertently created a ripple effect, emboldening others to assert their rights and challenge the arbitrary enforcement of rules. The HOA itself began to fracture. Board members who had once unthinkingly followed Mrs. Patterson distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with ongoing legal exposure. Meetings became tense and awkward, with fewer residents willing to participate. Her authority, once absolute, had eroded to the point where she could no longer enforce rules without question. Every attempt to regain control was met with scrutiny, from both the legal system and the community she had once dominated. It was a slow and quiet victory, but one that carried profound implications. Unchecked power, particularly when wielded against ordinary homeowners, could be successfully challenged. Max, of course, remained a central figure in this journey. The moment he was threatened with chemical spray had been a turning point, not just legally, but emotionally. His calm presence, unwavering loyalty, and the apparent importance of his role as a service animal reminded me daily why standing firm was essential. The ordeal strengthened our bond, and every walk through the neighborhood now felt like a subtle reclamation of the peace that had been stolen from us. Where once I had felt apprehension with every glance from a neighbor, I now experienced a quiet confidence and sense of security. One surprising effect of the conflict was the way it reshaped my own perspective on the neighborhood. Where I had once felt confined by rules, inspections, and arbitrary fines, I now saw the potential for community engagement that was fair and transparent. The ordeal illuminated the flaws inherent in unchecked HOA power, the vulnerability of residents to intimidation, and the necessity of awareness, preparation, and documentation. I began informal discussions with other homeowners about compliance, transparency, and collective safeguards, laying the groundwork for a more balanced and accountable community structure. There were also unexpected personal lessons. Months of stress, sleepless nights, and relentless harassment had tested my patience, resilience, and resolve. I discovered the importance of maintaining composure in the face of provocation, the value of meticulous record-keeping, and the empowerment that comes from understanding one's legal rights. The psychological toll had been heavy, but the victory, both legal and moral, was profoundly affirming. I realized that standing up to injustice is rarely easy, yet the consequences of inaction are far worse. In the aftermath, Mrs. Patterson's behavior underwent a dramatic change. She became more cautious, guarded, and less visible within the community. Any attempt to exert her previous level of control was met with resistance or immediate legal scrutiny. Board meetings, once dominated by her voice, now required more transparency and adherence to documented procedures. While she remained technically in her role, her influence had been neutralized. The neighborhood, freed from her oppressive oversight, slowly began to regain a sense of balance and fairness. The broader community impact was also profound. Conversations about HOA rules, residents' rights, and the enforcement of arbitrary fines became more common. People began questioning policies, requesting clarifications, and documenting interactions with the board. Awareness grew, and a culture of accountability began to take root. Where once the fear of retaliation silenced dissent, the example of standing firm against Mrs. Patterson provided a blueprint for others to follow. It was a subtle, yet decisive shift. The community had learned that compliance did not mean submission, and that advocacy for fairness could coexist with respect for shared spaces. Financially, resolving fines and citations was a relief. Many charges were overturned or dismissed once legal counsel intervened, and the threat of liens or additional penalties was removed. This tangible vindication was necessary, but it was the intangible consequences, the restoration of peace, the reclaiming of autonomy, and the affirmation of rights that carried the most weight. I had not just survived the harassment, I had transformed it into a moment of empowerment. Emotionally, the experience left a lasting imprint. There were days when the anxiety resurfaced, triggered by a letter, a phone call, or a familiar gesture from a neighbor. But over time, the sense of vulnerability diminished, replaced by a cautious optimism. Max continued to provide a grounding, presence, a reminder that loyalty, patience, and vigilance were as crucial as any legal strategy. The ordeal had taught me to recognize subtle forms of intimidation, to trust my instincts, and to respond strategically rather than reactively. As the neighborhood settled into this new reality, I noticed subtle changes in social dynamics. Residents were kinder, more communicative, and more willing to collaborate. The shared experience of witnessing the confrontation and its legal resolution fostered a sense of collective responsibility. People began to discuss issues openly, share concerns, and offer support to one another. The oppressive environment had been dismantled, and in its place, a cautious but growing sense of community emerged. The lasting lesson, however, was clear. Vigilance is essential in any community governed by rules, particularly when individuals with unchecked authority enforce those rules. Power can be abused and systems can be manipulated to intimidate. Still, awareness, preparation, and courage can level the playing field. By standing firm, documenting carefully, and leveraging legal protections, it is possible to confront injustice effectively. This truth extended beyond my personal experience, offering guidance for anyone facing similar challenges in their own neighborhoods. Looking back, the journey from harassment to resolution was transformative. It began with minor irritations, letters about hedge heights and mailbox colors, but escalated into a complex web of fines, inspections, and psychological warfare. Each step demanded patience, strategy, and careful documentation. The climax, where the abuse of power collided with legal authority, was the turning point that allowed justice to prevail. And the resolution reinforced that perseverance, clarity, and strategic action could overcome even the most entrenched systems of intimidation. Ultimately, the impact extended beyond the immediate conflict. The HOA was now under increased scrutiny. Residents were more informed and empowered, and the community as a whole had gained a deeper understanding of rights, responsibilities, and the importance of accountability. Mrs. Patterson, once a symbol of fear and control, had been exposed, her influence diminished, and the neighborhood had reclaimed its sense of fairness and respect. It was a profound transformation, one that demonstrated the power of resilience, documentation, and measured action in the face of adversity. In practical terms, life began to regain its rhythm. Walks with Max were once again peaceful, evenings in the garden were relaxing rather than stressful, and simple interactions with neighbors felt less fraught with tension. The psychological liberation was as important as the legal victory. The fear that had once permeated daily life had lifted, replaced by confidence and a sense of justice achieved. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, I realized that the most significant outcome wasn't just the defeat of Mrs. Patterson or the nullification of fines, it was the empowerment of myself and the community. Standing up to abuse, confronting harassment with facts and legal backing, and maintaining composure under pressure had created a ripple effect of awareness, solidarity, and resilience. It was a lesson that would echo far beyond the boundaries of our neighborhood, applicable to any situation where authority is misused and justice must be asserted. Max remained at my side, a silent witness to the ordeal and a reminder of why persistence mattered. His calm, loyal presence had been central to navigating the crisis, and protecting him had become synonymous with defending the principles of fairness and dignity. The bond between us had strengthened, and every peaceful morning in the yard became a quiet celebration of what we had endured and overcome together. The community, once stifled by fear, gradually began to embrace a culture of transparency and accountability. Residents now questioned arbitrary rules, documented communications, and engaged more actively in HOA decisions. The shift was subtle but significant. A neighborhood that had been intimidated into silence now found its voice. The lessons learned from this experience set a precedent, reminding everyone that compliance does not mean submission, and that advocating for fairness is not only possible, but also essential. As time passed, the memory of harassment lingered, but it no longer dictated daily life. The peace that returned was hard-won and deeply appreciated. The HOA's overreach had been curtailed, Mrs. Patterson's influence diminished, and a renewed sense of community resilience had taken root. The experience underscored the importance of vigilance, documentation, and strategic action, illustrating that even in seemingly small communities, the principles of justice and fairness must be actively defended. Looking forward, the neighborhood is expected to continue thriving under this newfound awareness. Residents are more proactive, communication is more transparent, and participation in HOA activities is informed by experience rather than fear. The incident served as both a cautionary tale and an inspiring example, demonstrating that harassment, intimidation, and arbitrary authority can be confronted successfully with preparation, courage, and adherence to legal protections. The story, while concluded in its most immediate sense, leaves a lasting impression. Power can be abused, but perseverance, clarity, and courage can restore balance. Justice may not always come easily or quickly. Still, it can be achieved when one refuses to be intimidated, documents meticulously, and stands firm in the face of adversity. Max and I had emerged victorious, not through aggression but through patience, strategic action, and the unwavering belief that fairness could prevail. The ultimate takeaway is clear. No one should tolerate abuse of power, whether from a neighbor, an organization, or a governing body. Knowledge of rights, careful documentation, and courage are the tools that transform helplessness into empowerment. By asserting these principles, it is possible to reclaim not only one's home and peace of mind, but also to inspire a broader sense of accountability within the community. And so, as I sit on the porch, watching Max relax in the sunlight, I reflect on the journey from fear and harassment to vindication and empowerment. The lessons learned extend beyond lawns, mailboxes, and garden ornaments. They reach into the very heart of what it means to stand up for oneself, protect those who cannot defend themselves, and confront injustice with resolve. The neighborhood, forever changed, is now a place where vigilance, fairness, and courage are as valued as compliance, and where the story of standing firm against overreach serves as both a warning and an inspiration. The conflict had been intense, the stakes high, and the resolution hard-earned. Still, the outcome was clear. Justice had been served, balance restored, and a powerful lesson about resilience, courage, and accountability had been etched into the very fabric of the community.